In the 100 years since the first driver was killed in a car crash, this has become the 20th century way to die. Over 20 million people have been killed on the roads. This is the story of what we have learned from a century of crashes.
There's 3 crashes involved in the car crash. The car hits an object, that's crash number 1. Your body, if it's unrestrained, as it was in the old days, hits the inside of the car stops short, you keep going. So there's crash number 2, your body with the inside of the car. And then crash number 3, the organs inside your body keep going forward and crash against the walls on the inside of your body. Your heart crashes against the inside of your chest. Your brain crashes against the inside of the skull. And that type of velocity is relatively unique to car crashes.
Cars are now safer than they have ever been, but progress has come at a grim price. A gruesome catalogue of research on brave volunteers, live animals, and even the bodies of the dead. They have all suffered to make cars less likely to kill and maim. At first, no one questioned the death toll.
Most people accepted danger. They considered it part of life. They didn't appreciate the fact that they could have the pleasure of the vehicle, but without the dangers that might be associated with it. They just didn't. It had never been that way, so they didn't understand what safety was all about.
In February 1898, on the road from London to Brighton, one Henry Lindfield became the first motoring fatality. 12 years later, the car had overtaken everything else on the road as a killer. The 20s brought mass ownership and massive casualties. But the manufacturers argued the deaths were not their responsibility.
There is a dominant traffic safety ideology which was fostered by the auto companies and many of their front groups, like safety councils that they would fund. And that ideology explained all traffic deaths and injuries by what was then called, quote, the nut behind the wheel, unquote, namely the driver. It was always the driver's fault. The driver was drunk. The driver fell asleep. The driver was careless. The driver was incompetent. There was never any attention to what human factors engineers knew all along, that the driver-highway vehicle network were interdependent. You wanted an interventionist engineering system so that if drivers failed, or if the weather was bad, or if the highways were slippery, and the crashes occurred, there would be a crash-worthy engineering framework around the driver that would save the occupants.
In the early days, even the simplest modifications would have made cars less lethal. Many of the safety improvements made in the last 40 years had been based on Professor Larry Patrick's work. As a teenager, his first car was a Model T Ford.
I noticed that the instrument panel looks like it's fairly rigid, so that might be a bad feature. Certainly the small diameter end of the steering column here would be dangerous for a chest impact. One of the most dangerous features is the windshield, which is only plate glass. That would be glass like you have in your house windows. When it breaks into shards that are as sharp as razors and cut very badly.
The 30s brought windshields of laminated safety glass, and the new closed bodies gave the occupants more protection. But cars were becoming more powerful. As speeds rose, so did the death toll. Ideas on safety were still purely focused on accident prevention.
The mindset was that because people cause accidents, you should change people's behavior. And the idea of actually addressing what goes on in the crash phase was something that came later.
The modern approach to car safety was born out of the Second World War. Unlike drivers, pilots were precious. Air Force engineers discovered that if they could keep the cockpit intact and the pilot was strapped in, they might survive even severe crashes. If it worked for pilots, why not for drivers? Now, for the first time, work began on making car crashes survivable. But well into the 50s, vital information was still missing. By now, cars had killed over 5 million people, but amazingly, no one had thought to examine how they actually killed. Until a new breed of accident investigator arrived on the scene.
Police at that time were only interested in cleaning up the scene. They had absolutely no training whatsoever in traffic investigation. And my partner then, a pathologist, and I would go to the scenes, and we did in October of '61 to our first one.
As Don Hulke studied crash after crash, it became clear which part of the car was most deadly for drivers.
Here we have an automobile in a head-on crash with the tree, and you can see that the steering wheel is well out of position, and the individual then catches up to it, bends the steering wheel, and put his face here on the center of the hub, causing massive crushing of the bones of the face on the left side of his lower jaw and also of his nose. Here, for example, is another case of the same sort of thing. Here the unrestrained driver moves forward, gets to the steering wheel, collapses the top part of the wheel rim, now exposes the rigid hub of the steering wheel that gets him in the chest to cause the significant, serious, debilitating injuries. Obviously, there were no seatbelts in these cars, and today this kind of thing can't happen with a person wearing a lap shoulder belt.
However dangerous the car interior was, all the early statistics showed being thrown out was even more lethal. In Britain, one of the first to study accidents was Murray Mackay.
Well, there was a mindset in the early days that to be thrown out of a car meant that you were thrown clear. You were less likely to be injured. One of the early findings that came from my research was that, in fact, if you're thrown out, you're much more likely to be killed or seriously injured. And therefore, studying why people got thrown out because doors open or because windscreens came out was very important in demonstrating that if you could change door latches or windscreen mountings, you would diminish the injuries and deaths that would come from ejection.
From the brain injury point of view, it's caused a whole new category of brain injuries that are due to the extreme violence of the crashes that occur, the tremendous amounts of energy that are input into the head from the violence of the car crash, something that never existed before the automobile.
Many in the motor industry still claimed crashes would never be survivable. But research at Wayne State University in Detroit proved them wrong. Faced with the epidemic of head injuries, these safety pioneers decided to study how skulls fractured. And however distasteful it was to many, they decided they needed to test real human corpses. In a disused lift shaft, dead bodies were dropped onto a metal plate. Over the next 30 years, cadaver tests, mainly in America, played a crucial role in building a complete map of the human body's tolerance to injury.
Well, the bodies were not too difficult to get as long as we didn't want very many of them. The bodies were donated for research at the med school, and they used them for anatomy studies and teaching. And of course, they had first call on the bodies.
The embalmed corpses were fitted with instruments to record the precise movement of the head as it hit the metal plate.
We put accelerometers on the back of the skull, and with the acceleration we could tell what the force was. It's a type of job that is not very pleasant, but after a while you get used to it, and it's not very pleasant, I suppose, to operate on somebody, but surgeons do it all the time. So we got used to it and suffered through it.
The head drop showed how much force it actually took to crack a skull and cause brain injury.
The thing that surprised me was how much the head could take without being fractured. And we found that, oddly enough, the head can take a very high force before it is seriously injured. About 400 Gs, which represents probably a ton and a half, but only for very short times. We're talking about thousandths of a second. And then it can stand a much lower force for a longer time.
So volunteers subjected themselves to massive G-forces, coming to a stop from over 600 miles per hour in a few seconds. The results showed that without an impact, the head could take a very rapid deceleration. Gradually, the Wayne State University team built up a complete picture of the tolerance of the brain to violent shaking. A graph of what forces over what duration would cause damage. Provided the impact to the head was below the curve, they knew there would be no brain injury in a car crash.
If we could determine that human head could take 1,200 pounds for 10 milliseconds, then we could design a car so that that would be the maximum force that would be applied to the head.
But reduced head injuries didn't sell cars. What did was style. And style often conflicted with safety. There was no pressure from the government or the buying public to build safer cars.
The Sabre, thrusting toward tomorrow. This is the mood of the Motorama.
It was largely a style over safety. They developed a formula led by General Motors, thinking that they could increase the sale of cars by focusing the consumer's attention on the visible stylistic features, comfort features, horsepower features of the car. And that grew into an almost garish pinnacle of frivolity, with the tail fins and the hood ornaments and the enormous hype on horsepower, rather than the more functional aspects of the car, such as operational safety, brakes, handling, crashworthiness, fuel efficiency, pollution control, or ease of maintenance.
The Oldsmobile Holiday.
In the late 50s, one group finally decided it was time cars got safer. Not the government, not concerned citizens, but a company, Liberty Mutual Car Insurance.
The Cadillac 60 Special.
We were really trying to speak to two audiences. One was the public. We wanted them to appreciate that cars could be safer at that point in time. And also we were interested in demonstrating to Detroit, making them aware that there were ways of doing things that they might not have considered because of their cost limitation.
Liberty Mutual's survival car was never intended as a serious production design, but to highlight the many ways in which conventional cars were dangerous.
Notice the unusual arrangement of this vehicle. We have 5 seats facing forward and 1 seat facing to the rear. The idea was that if you had a single passenger, you put him in the center seat facing rear, which gave him the maximum amount of protection. And we also put the driver in a center seat. And instead of giving the driver a restraint system, we actually held him in place with a moving dashboard, which came back and wrapped around them, in effect. And it was padded, so you spread the impact over a larger area, and sort of packaged him in a place so that he could not fall forward, could not hit his head on anything. And instead of having a steering wheel, we have a set of handles that you see there, which are actually used for steering the vehicle. And this allowed us to get away from the normal steering wheel, which can impale the driver in a frontal impact. We felt very strongly that the automobile companies could provide a degree of safety that might cost a little bit more at first, but would not interfere at all with the use of the vehicle.
The safety message was ignored. The public wanted a fast, fun car, even if it killed them. By the mid-60s, cars were killing 60,000 people a year in America. In Britain, someone died on the roads every hour. The politicians were beginning to lose patience with the manufacturers. So General Motors contracted Wayne State University to do more research into how the whole body was injured in crashes. So began another series of gruesome experiments on the dead.
We studied impact to the head, to the chest, to the knees, any part of the body that could be injured in the automobile.
After the corpses, the next step was to use a living human body.
I was the volunteer. It was a matter of, I was in charge of the lab, and if anybody got hurt, I was responsible. I figured if I hurt myself, that was one thing, but I didn't want to take a chance on hurting anyone else. I had about 6 impacts, and that was enough for a day. And then when I found out how much my chest deflected, I decided that I didn't want to do it anymore. And in fact, in the paper I wrote on it, I suggested that we have other volunteers, but nobody else has volunteered yet.
Over the next few years, Larry continued to study the biomechanics of the human body, usually involving experiments on himself, his head, his chest, and his neck in a whiplash study at 40 miles an hour. Larry had done what he could. A new kind of test subject was needed. Animals have provided most of the information about injuries to internal organs, like the liver, the kidneys, and the lungs.
Primarily, the animal tests were to study internal organ injuries. In a cadaver, you can't very often tell whether certain organs were injured or not. The pigs that are, for example, that are raised for this purpose have organs about the same size as the human, so they were used primarily for that.
As the chilling data on every major bone and vital organ was gathered, it was fed back into the design of realistic dummies, which the engineers could crash test over and over. Dummies would be the crucial link in improving car safety. One of the first features to benefit from the emerging biomechanical data was a revolutionary new steering column developed by General Motors in the early 60s.
This steering column, if you're thrown against it in a crash here, it's designed to give down here. That means that instead of stabbing you in the chest like a spear, it will gently and protectively absorb the energy of your crash forces.
We had a pretty good correlation for the load on the chest and the occurrence or non-occurrence of fractures of the rib. And that is the set of data that we used to determine how we were going to, or what force level we should put into the energy-absorbing steering column. It was just basically that force level that we felt would not break ribs.
All cars in Europe and America now have collapsible steering columns. In a crash, they reduce the risk of death to the driver by about a half. But most manufacturers were slow to install the greatest lifesaver of all time.
Six, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go!
The modern seatbelt was invented by Volvo and first fitted to their cars in 1959. But for several years, few other manufacturers offered the crucial combination of lap and chest restraint. Many cars were still just fitted with a two-point belt across the lap.
We saw in the accidents where two-point belts were used that there was still a high risk of impact from the occupant towards dashboard, for example, by the head or the chest area. And the only solution to that problem was to add also a shoulder portion of the belt system. And since the shoulder belt is lying on rigid parts like the rib cage, we felt very confident that there was no risk introduced with this system.
For years, other manufacturers resisted the lap shoulder belt, saying the new design might itself cause injuries. But Volvo thought otherwise.
At that time, engineers felt that they have had enough knowledge from the road and studying accidents with other restraint systems. And I think they were fairly confident that the three-point belt system would be the next step, a good solution.
American manufacturers continue to fund research into the possible dangers of lap shoulder belts.
We found that we did get injuries to the cadaver, and one of our papers we have where the belt goes across the chest. If you get to a high enough force accident, you're going to fracture some ribs. So we would have ribs fractured, but the rib fractures are rarely fatal.
Even while the experiments were going on, there were calls from doctors to follow Volvo's lead. But the governments did nothing. The public weren't aware of what they were missing, and the manufacturers were unmoved. Then one day, an idealistic young American lawyer began sifting through reports on unused safety features. His anger sparked off a chain of events which would change car safety forever.
As a law student at Harvard Law School, I came across some of the research writings, and I was stunned. I realized that there were a lot of life-saving safety devices on the shelf in Detroit that engineers had built and innovated over the years, like seatbelts, like head restraints, that were never put in cars. And I began to ask why. Why were they selling style and they weren't selling safety?
The seatbelt was a classic example. If Volvo's belts were so dangerous, then why were they already being used by the most experienced drivers in America?
Race car drivers have been using seatbelts for years and tumbling and providing all kinds of biodynamic data as to the life-saving value. And the auto companies resisted the standard equipment seatbelt year after year, including one of their safety engineers at an engineering conference I attended in the early 60s, saying seatbelts were dangerous because they would split people open and their organs would rip out, etc. There's a very simple reason why they resisted seatbelts. It focused public attention on crashes, on life, on death. They didn't want the psychosexual aura surrounding stylistic cars to be tainted by any concern that these cars may be in destructive crashes.
In 1966, after Ralph Nader published a bestseller on the dangers of American cars, he was called to the Senate to testify at a special hearing into deaths on the roads. General Motors were one of his main targets, and the car giant responded by hiring a private detective to dig up dirt on this unknown young lawyer. But their attempt to discredit Nader backfired. The detective was exposed, and the president of General Motors was called in to explain.
I want to apologize here and now to the members of this subcommittee and Mr. Nader. I personally have no interest whatsoever in knowing Mr. Nader's political beliefs, his religious beliefs and attitudes, his credit rating, or his personal habits regarding sex, alcohol, or any other subject.
It was a great news story, and the publicity made Ralph Nader a national hero, whose words now carried great weight.
Many safety features sometimes cost only pennies more, and many times cost less. A couple examples. This collapsible steering shaft by GM costs them no more once they retool for it than the other type of steering shaft. The safer instrument panels, and instrument panels today are killing between 5,000 and 8,000 people by being struck against them. A safer instrument panel is actually cheaper to manufacture.
It provided a lot of public attention and force behind the passage of the first comprehensive motor vehicle safety law in American history.
From January 1967, cars had to meet 22 new safety standards, covering everything from the steering column to the rear-view mirror. And front seat belts now had to be fitted by law. Europe soon followed with similar crash protection standards. And in the early 70s, for the first time, deaths on the road started to fall. But the public seemed determined to undermine the engineers. They just wouldn't wear their seatbelts. It would take Britain 20 years to pass a law requiring seatbelts to be worn. Americans were particularly bad at belting up. But something had been invented which could save people who didn't want to save themselves.
Reliable crash protection can't depend on human cooperation. It has to be built into the car, and it has to work when it's needed, automatically.
First airbag that I used was one that was produced by Chrysler Corporation, and it was inflated by gunpowder. And when we inflated it, it would smell up the lab, so that we had to do it on Friday so the lab could clear out for 2 days before we could come back in to use it again.
Airbags presented all sorts of new concerns.
A lot of people said that the pressure in the car produced by the airbag inflating would cause ear damage. So in order to check that, I got in the car and inflated the airbag and to see whether it would hurt my ears. First of all, I had an audiogram made before and an audiogram made afterwards. When I got out of the car, my colleagues were standing around and they were talking like that and not saying anything, trying to make me think that my ears were damaged.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6,
But there were real fears that airbags might actually be lethal.
One of our concerns is what happens to the person if he's close to the system, near the system, when the airbag is deployed. Since that deployment is so rapid, we were concerned with how the chest was being compressed, the rate at which the chest was being compressed, and the effect it would have on the internal organs, specifically the heart.
Their tests suggested any airbag which inflated fast enough to save lives might also kill. Animal experiments confirmed their fears.
We had to go to a physiological model that had a heart. We had to find out where the heart would still be beating, what damage we did to the heart, because this was specifically addressed as to what happens to the heart.
The animal experiments in the early 80s convinced American manufacturers that for the time being, airbags were unacceptably dangerous. The United States government took more than 10 years to decide whether their benefits outweighed the risks. Eventually, this American invention appeared first in a European car.
Der Fahrer-Airbag ist im Lenkrad integriert.
In 1986, Mercedes fitted driver airbags to all their models.
Durch einen elektronischen Sensor ausgelöst, sofern eine bestimmte Unfallschwere vorliegt.
The combination of a collapsible steering column, controlled crumple zones, and the airbag have dramatically improved safety in front-on collisions.
Von Verletzungen im Brust- und Kopfbereich im Vergleich zum
But there is another way to die in crashes, where none of these safety features will do you any good at all. A side impact. There's just 6 inches between you and death.
When you are sitting in a car, and if you were to get broadsided by another car, you're sitting right next to your own door. And the door comes in very suddenly at very high velocities, within about 20 milliseconds, which is well less than 1/10 of a second. And the forces that can be generated to your body in that type of impact are in excess of 3,000 to 4,000 pounds to your upper torso. And when you have that kind of speed and that kind of force buildup, it's easily understood how there are so many fatalities and injuries in this type of condition.
If you're going to make a sizable dent in the numbers of people injured or killed on the roads, then you've got to address the side impact problem as well. At the time that we got interested in it, there were no dummies in the world that were suitable for measuring the response in side impacts.
Amazingly, by the 70s there was still little information about damage caused to the human body in side impacts. It took 10 years and over 100 cadaver tests to develop a specialized new dummy that could be used in side impact safety design. SID, with a new chest developed for measuring blows from the side, was finally rolled out in 1986.
In this test we just ran, we put padding at the different levels of the human body: shoulder, chest, abdomen, and pelvis. And we tune the crush strengths of this pad to be in tune with the stiffnesses of different parts of the body. If the engineers were tuning the padding in the door to the strength of the human body, you could substantially reduce injury.
But so far no manufacturer has modified their doors. And only from this year will new European cars finally have to pass a side impact test, 31 years after front standards were introduced. By the early 80s, the nature of head injuries was changing. Airbags and seatbelts had cut down skull fractures, but one form of lethal injury was being replaced by something more mysterious.
said 50 a rock. I would say that's probably been 30 minutes ago.
Accident victims were still dying in comas, but now nothing was showing up on the brain scans.
Initially, we were very depressed because we knew the brain is injured, and when we went out to talk to families about this, we'd say, your son is in a coma, he has bad brain injury, and the families would say, well, what is the injury? And we would look at one another and say, well, we don't exactly know, but we know the brain is badly injured. And we'd look on the CAT scans and find virtually nothing, sometimes a little drop of blood, but hardly anything.
At their laboratories in Philadelphia, Dr. Generali's team decided the only way to understand this invisible killer was to reproduce the injury in an animal. In the early 80s, they performed a series of experiments on monkeys. This was the price to be paid for understanding head injuries. But the experiment sparked fierce protests from animal rights activists. The researchers' aim was to put a baboon in coma.
The system that we were using to produce the injury was the animal head was never impacted. It was encased in a helmet. The helmet was attached to a linkage, and the linkage was programmed to move at a certain velocity over a short distance, so there was no loading of the neck, but we could rotate the head in different directions at different velocities.
They discovered that no kind of forward movement ever resulted in coma. But shaking the head sideways produced dramatically different results.
As soon as we produced the rotation in a lateral direction, the animal was in coma. That first animal we studied for 6 weeks in coma. No one had ever produced coma in an animal model. You don't get coma in frontal crashes. You did get coma on side impact. Boxers have probably known for 1,000 years that if you want to knock someone out, you don't punch them in the nose. You hit them on the side of the head, and you produce a very violent rotational acceleration.
The brain is made of two hemispheres, connected by nerve axons which run between them. Slamming the head sideways pulls one hemisphere away from the other, dangerously stretching those axons.
What we've got here are some axons.
They look pretty bad.
When they looked at the nerves from this section of the brain under the microscope, they had expected to find the axons stretched to breaking point. And severed nerves meant permanent brain damage or death.
And a great revelation took place. People had the notion that at the instant of an impact to the head, there was a damage resulting from tearing of neurological material. And what we knew at that time about central nervous system tissue, that was irreversible, that was final. Instead, what we found, I think to the surprise of many, was that the axons were indeed stretched, but they weren't torn.
The stretching seemed to make the nerve axons slowly swell up and balloon out, eventually destroying themselves in a gradual process that only started hours after the impact.
And you can actually see the increase in swelling, the increase in the number of axons that are exhibiting damage as that time course continues.
Suddenly there was an extraordinary medical possibility. If most of the damage happened hours after the crash, then perhaps drugs could be developed to stop the nerve swelling, in time to save thousands of lives. Neurosurgeons around the world are now experimenting with new drugs which might dramatically improve the chances of surviving a coma. Without the animal experiments, they say these drugs would never have been developed. After 100 years of experiments and safety innovations, dramatically more people survive car crashes. 100 years of experiments and safety innovations, dramatically more people survive car crashes than ever before. Car designs are now subjected to increasingly demanding tests. Few motorists now die if they're wearing a seatbelt. In the 90s, the battle is increasingly to prevent serious injuries to survivors. The gruesome research into the effects of violent impacts on the body has provided car designers with sophisticated test dummies. But the map of human tolerance has yet to be extended to the most vulnerable passengers of all. Crash protection for children is still hampered by the lack of realistic dummies.
Well, I think this is an area where we are lacking in very sound information. There's a lot of information for adults, but when we're trying to design dummies and when we're trying to understand what dummies, the readings we measure from child dummies, what that means in terms of protecting children, that's certainly a weak area. At the moment we use scaled down results from adults, but of course children aren't scaled down adults. Their dynamics are very different and their development is very different.
We have to protect unbelted occupants as well as belted, so we have to have fairly large aggressive airbags. As a consequence of this, passenger side airbags have been responsible for, I believe, 49 child deaths to date, and many serious injuries as well. You need to have a dummy that has a biofidelic response in the first place, and secondly, you need to know the injury criteria which you need to stay below in order that the airbag is not injurious to children.
Child restraint systems have all had to be developed without basic biological information. Rear-facing seats for infants are highly effective, but forward-facing restraints for older children are more difficult to design. And how do their bodies cope with seat belts designed for adults?
Historically, the UK has considered testing with whole cadavers to be too sensitive a subject in this area, so we haven't done any work over here with whole cadavers, although we have made a great use of the information from cadaver testing that's been performed in Germany, France and the United States.
Only one laboratory in Germany has ever performed child cadaver tests on any scale. The experiments on the bodies of children were stopped in the late 80s, before they had the technology to gather detailed information.
What few tests have been done have not involved much instrumentation, so even though it's a little bit appropriate, it's not very appropriate, nothing akin to what we have for adults. So at the time, there's no way to develop a really biofidelic child dummy because of the lack of information. We don't collect child cadavers in the United States. It's probably a sensitive issue, but there's no question that somehow we need better injury tolerance information on children, and we don't have that available.
Despite all the research, thousands die needlessly on the roads every year. After a century of carnage, the public still does not demand that all available safety innovations are built into every car.
The motor vehicle is one of the few products in our economy, in the global economy, that probably produces more damage every year in terms of economic costs and health costs than the actual sales dollar volume of the new cars produced.